Most interesting to me is the beginning of the Franck report, where they pose and answer the question, do we as scientists have standing to insert ourselves into the policy debate about how the bomb should be used? And their answer to that question was crystal clear and straightforward. What they argued was that precisely because they were in possession of specialist technical expertise and knowledge, they had an extra obligation to insert themselves into the policy debate. It's their technical expertise gave them the moral obligation to become involved in the policy debates.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelly Lesher. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Don Howard, a professor at the University of Notre Dame in the Department of Philosophy. He is the former director and a fellow of the university's Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values, where he is currently co-director of the center's Ethics of Emerging Technologies focus area. You will hear more about these passions in the course of our discussion. Professor Howard is an expert on many topics of interest to us in physics, including scientific ethics and individuals such as Einstein and Bohr. In order for parts of our conversation to make sense, I need to provide a little bit of background. For the past 10 or 11 years, I've spent my summers at the University of Notre Dame's Nuclear Science Laboratory. I bring a couple of students from University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, where I work, with me, where we work with collaborators on experiments. They have a really great facility in nuclear science. My students take part in the Research Experience for Undergraduates, or REU program activities, which include a series of lectures on scientific ethics given by Don. These lectures are great research for students and really make them think about the impact of their work. So this is my connection to Notre Dame that Don refers to in our conversation. People look back and talk about the morality of using the bomb, but was there a lot of questioning about building it at the time? Did the scientists want to play a role in building this bomb?
At the time when the Manhattan Project got started, there was virtual unanimity among everyone in the North American, British scientific communities that this was something that had to be done. They all knew that they were embarking on a project that was going to transform the world in ways that were going to complicate a lot of things in the future. But the threat of there being a German atomic bomb in the hands of Hitler with no deterrent in the hands of the Allies, that was too frightening a possibility to contemplate. So no, in the beginning, they knew it was a morally fraught decision that they were making, but they were almost to a person resolute in understanding that at that time, that was unquestionably the right way to go. Lots and lots of British scientists took part in the project. A lot of Canadian scientists took part in the project. It wasn't just a U.S. thing.
So we heard from Richard Rhodes when he was on the podcast that once the scientists got to Los Alamos, that in the first orientation, it was like, we're building a bomb. That's the point of this project. Did anyone at that point just say, okay, this is not what I signed, I'm going to leave?
Nope, not at that point. More remarkable still is that so few people left the project in 1945.
When is the point that scientists start kind of second guessing themselves or start asking these really kind of deep moral philosophical questions of, should we do this? Should we have done this? Should we continue doing this?
So that really becomes a phenomenon in the spring of 1945. In May and June of 1945, we are at a point in the history of the project where everyone is pretty sure that the bomb is going to work. It wouldn't be tested until July, but everybody was pretty sure that it was going to work. But by the latter half of May, Hitler was dead. The Germans had surrendered. There was no longer any threat of a German atomic bomb. Indeed, we had known, thanks to the intelligence gathered through the Alsos project, since late December, that there was no real prospect of a German atomic bomb. So there they are. Germany has surrendered. We know there was never a chance that they were going to build a bomb, but it was building a bomb as a deterrent to a German bomb that was the moral motivation for Einstein and Szilard and Oppenheimer and everyone else involved in the project. So here they are on the verge of success in this incredible achievement that they pulled off, but the moral premise that it was based upon was suddenly gone. And so many people in the project started asking themselves and their colleagues, well, what is going to be done with the bomb? And in the minds of many people, concern grew that it would be used against Japan. And worst of all, they worried that it might be used in a surprise attack on a civilian target. And that possibility in particular set a lot of people to thinking. And the most interesting manifestation of that was what happened with the Manhattan Project outpost at the University of Chicago called the Metallurgical Lab, which was directed by a refugee Jewish German physicist, James Franck, where Franck and his colleague Rabinowitz brought together virtually the whole staff of the Metallurgical Lab for lengthy conversations about how they felt about their own role, their own responsibilities, what they thought was the most appropriate path forward, knowing that the bomb was likely to succeed. And the fruit of that conversation was a memorandum, a lengthy memorandum that has come to be called the Franck Report, in which they set out their arguments for why the bomb shouldn't be used in a surprise attack on civilian targets, arguing not only was this morally problematic, but also arguing that if that's the way we did it, that would seriously harm our relationship with the Soviet Union at that time and complicate post-war relations with the Soviet Union. In effect, they anticipated much of what happened in the Cold War and the post-World War II nuclear arms race. To me, most interesting about the Franck Report, however, is not the part where they argue against a surprise attack on a civilian target. Most interesting to me is the beginning of the Franck Report, where they pose and answer the question, do we as scientists on the Manhattan Project have standing to insert ourselves into the policy debate about how the bomb should be used? And their answer to that question was crystal clear and straightforward. What they argued in the report was that precisely because they were in possession of specialist technical expertise and knowledge, they had an extra obligation to insert themselves into the policy debate. It's their technical expertise gave them the moral obligation to become involved in the policy debates. Of course, a lot of other people disagreed, and most famously, Oppenheimer disagreed with that. Oppenheimer was a member of a body called the Interim Committee, which consisted of senior scientists and senior policy people who were part of that very small group in the know about the bomb, advising President Truman in the very late stages of the war about atomic policy. Oppenheimer, being on that committee, had the opportunity, had he chosen to take advantage of it, to be a voice sharing some of the concerns of scientists on the project. But he famously said after the war about that crucial last meeting of the Interim Committee, I paraphrase, all that was expected of the scientists on the committee were technical answers to technical questions, and that he thought that he had no right to insert himself into the policy debate. I've always thought that the contrast between Oppenheimer's view, technical answers to technical questions, and the position taken in the Frank report, yes, as specialists, we have an extra obligation to insert ourselves into the policy debate. I've always thought that that contrast of opinions is profound and hugely important.
Looking back before World War II, when you look at research that was done before that, was that kind of the role of a scientist, that the military would give scientists a question that they just provided an answer for? They just developed something and they weren't expected to think about it. They were just expected to give these technical answers to technical questions.
I think that that had been a kind of common assumption about the relationship between scientists and engineers and governments for a long time prior to World War II. It's not as though scientists were not working on technologies of war that, in some respects, posed moral questions like in kind to the moral questions that arose in connection with the bomb. One thinks, of course, about all the research that was done back in the First World War on first-generation chemical weapons. So the eminent German physical chemist Fritz Haber was the person who developed the first deployable chlorine gas weapon. But Haber never shed any tears about what he did. In fact, he was a very enthusiastic, gung-ho proponent of poison gas warfare. Similar research was done in the US. Similar research was done in Britain. I myself am unaware of any example at that time of prominent scientists expressing moral qualms about participation in that kind of research. If I might, thinking about our Notre Dame connections, as an aside, I might remark on the fact that one of the poison gas weapons that we developed in the First World War, it was a blister agent called lewisite, was based on a chemical process that was discovered a decade earlier by our own Father Newland, after whom the physics building is named at Notre Dame, in the same research project, dissertation research project, that led him to discover the chemical process for making neoprene. So our dearly beloved Father Newland had a hand indirectly in poison gas research. The person who oversaw the plant that was built late in World War I to manufacture lewisite on an industrial scale was the chemist James Bryant Conan, who went on to become the president of Harvard University. Again, in his case, I know of no expression, certainly not at the time, of any moral reservations about his involvement in that as a younger scientist.
So that's an extremely interesting connection, especially because he was a priest. So was Father Newland still alive when his discovery then was taken to this industrial scale and used in war?
Oh, yes, very definitely.
Did he express any moral concerns about this and about his hand in this discovery?
My understanding is that he was interviewed about this and thought, as did Haber in Germany, that if you can develop a weapon that is so scary that it might permanently put an end to war, that was a perfectly moral enterprise to engage in.
So that leads to the question, what made the atomic bomb so different? Was it the weapon, or was it the scientists involved that brought up this moral quandary about whether or not to use it? It wasn't even a decade. What changed in that period of time?
Some things are similar between, say, poison gas and atomic weapons. Some things are different. So a common moral critique of both kinds of weapons is that they are inherently incapable of respecting the principle in the international law of armed conflict that's called discrimination. That is to say, you're supposed to be able, or at least make a good faith effort, to distinguish combatants from non-combatants and apply force only to combatants. But Poison gas, once it's out there in the air, it drifts wherever the winds will take it. You might try to control it, but you can't really. And so you can't prevent harm to civilians. And in the same way, an atomic bomb can't be used in a way that spares civilians and directs harm only to combatants, except in really highly unusual circumstances. That's something the two kinds of technologies have in common. What I think made the real difference in the thinking of a lot of people involved in the Manhattan Project was the sheer scale of the destruction that could be wrought by the use of atomic weapons. You might say, well, that's just a difference of degree, but I think that in the thinking of those who eventually became morally concerned about this, that difference of degree really came to be seen as a difference in kind and put nuclear weapons in a different moral category from even indiscriminate weapons like poison gas.
The other thing is we had already crossed the line of attacking civilians with all of the fire bombings.
Indeed, yeah, the strategic bombing campaign often targeted areas where there were lots of civilians who couldn't be spared harm. And so some people have said, well, it's just a different way. An atomic bomb is just a different way of affecting the kind of damage that we had already proven we could do with conventional munitions. But again, there's an issue of scale here. To kill 100,000 people with conventional bombing requires an enormous expenditure of effort. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of bombs. Whereas with an atomic weapon, you need only one plane and one bomb. And so, yes, we had industrialized mass killing in war before the atomic bomb. But again, there's something qualitatively different about the atomic bomb in that with it, you can kill so many people so quickly with just one plane and one bomb.
What happened then after the Frank report came out? How did the other scientists respond to this?
Well, one thing that happened is that Oppenheimer and General Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, went out of their way to suppress the circulation of such statements as this within the Manhattan Project. So a lot of people involved in the project simply never saw the Frank report, so weren't in a position to respond to it one way or another. But it's still a noteworthy fact and an interesting fact, to go back to something I said a few minutes ago, that surprisingly few people, comparatively speaking, became concerned enough about the moral challenge of atomic weapons to decide to drop out of working on the Manhattan Project. After the bomb was dropped, there were a couple of individuals who finally had enough. And perhaps the most prominent figure who falls in that category is the physicist Robert Wilson, who decided after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that he had had enough and was not going to do bomb research in the future. There's a recorded interview in a great documentary on the Manhattan Project with Wilson and his wife, recalling this moment. Wilson, when he's asked, how did you feel at that moment you heard the news about the bombing? He just sort of hemmed and hawed a bit. But his wife got this funny expression on her face, looked him in the eye and said, no, don't you remember? You went outside and threw up in the garbage can. You were so sickened by what you had heard. It's a wonderful moment in that interview.
Did anyone quit the project in between the surrender in Europe and dropping the bomb in Japan? Because the whole reason why, as you said, the moral premise had changed on why they were building the bomb. So when the target changed, did anyone decide that, okay, the moral reason I have for building this bomb, to beat the Germans to it, to end the war in Europe, that no longer exists. So I'm going to stop working on this.
So I don't know the careers of every person employed by the Manhattan Project, but my understanding, my very clear understanding, is that virtually no one left the project. in those months between the German surrender and the end of the war in the Pacific.
Do you think, though, perhaps that could be not for moral reasons, but just to see a project through?
Oh, of course, there's no question. And there are lots of recorded reflections of people on the project that make this clear, that they had devoted several years of their professional lives to working on one of the most technically sweet challenges anyone would ever have an opportunity to work on. So yes, they were psychologically really heavily invested in the success of the project and wanted to see it through. Philosophers of technology sometimes use the expression technological momentum to describe this kind of phenomenon, where a technology reaches a certain stage in development, where it, in a sense, I mean, not literally, but in a sense, starts to take on a life of its own, and in such a way that it becomes harder and harder for those involved to step back and take a clear view of where they are. Another term that is sometimes used to describe this phenomenon is a term that's widely used in the military. It's called mission fulfillment. You are tasked with a mission, and it is your duty to see that mission through to the end. And the concern has often been expressed that sense of obligation to fulfill the mission can also sometimes get in the way of taking a clear distance moral view of the work that one is involved in.
The scientists from the Met Lab had talked about this extra obligation that they feel they have because they are the ones that understand the technology. And they have this extra obligation to be involved in the policy. And then Oppenheimer takes this opposite stand of the traditional technical answers to technical questions. So does anything result in this view of scientists being involved in policy and science being involved in the government and changing the way that things are done in Washington? Do physicists get more involved in policy and government?
So it varies widely from individual to individual, from one subcommunity to another subcommunity. But there are many, many examples of scientists in many different fields who, in the years since the Second World War, have made the decision to insert themselves into public debate, policy debate, thinking in much the same way as did the authors of the Franck Report about how technical expertise entails an obligation to become involved. I've just published in the current issue of The American Scientist, the magazine of Sigma Xi, an article exploring this phenomenon under the title of The Obligation to Act. And I'll be giving a keynote address at this November's Sigma Xi annual meeting that will be an expanded version of the argument that I present in condensed form in that briefer published article. And there I survey a number of examples of scientists who have felt the same kind of sense of duty that the authors of the Franck Report felt. Perhaps for our purposes, the most helpful of these examples would be the NASA atmospheric physicist, James Hansen, who back in the 1980s was a leader in the development of the techniques for computer modeling of the global climate that is now the foundation of all research into the phenomenon of global warming. His work on climate modeling back in the 80s had already alerted him back at that time to the likelihood of global warming as an unavoidable consequence of the injection of more greenhouse gases into the environment. At the time, he testified before Congress. That was not at his initiative. He was invited to testify before Congress. But he gave a really compelling set of remarks about not just the technical side of the problem, but about the simple human urgency, the need to begin to take action. In later years, he recalled that at that time, he somewhat naively thought that having sounded the alarm, having testified before Congress, people in positions of power and authority would take it seriously and would begin to act. When, by the early 2000s, it became clear that progress wasn't being made, progress of the kind that he thought was absolutely critical. He made the decision at that time to begin going public on his own initiative in a variety of different forms, sort of pushing the envelope of what many people thought were the responsibilities of a scientist in the employ of the federal government. He became so active in trying to sound the alarm in the media, in public demonstrations. He became so much of an activist that the then head of NASA, who was a Bush administration appointee, tried very hard to muzzle Hansen. And it became something of a cause célèbre in the physics community, this attempt to censor Hansen. The APS, the American Physical Society, protested mightily on behalf of Hansen. And eventually his bosses were forced to back down, and he was given more leeway to continue with his advocacy on behalf of aggressive action on climate change. But by about 2011, 2012, even that expanded opportunity to act was leaving him frustrated that he still wasn't being effective enough. And so finally, he resigned from NASA so that he could do, in effect, full-time advocacy without having to look over his shoulder every time he wanted to speak. The American Physical Society, after the dust-up with the leadership of NASA, gave Hansen what's called the Leo Szilard Lectureship Award. It's an award given annually by APS to recognize individuals who take the kind of committed action to help steer the course of the way in which technology is being used and scientific discoveries are being used. APS, as it were, rewarded Hansen in this way for his really bold effort to sound the alarm, alert the public.
So why is this award named after Szilard?
It's named after Szilard because Szilard really stood out already back in the 1940s, even the late 30s, in being the kind of scientist who was especially alert to sort of moral, political, policy implications of new scientific discoveries and choosing to take action in response to that. The first famous example involving Szilard had to do with his drafting the letter to President Roosevelt that finally got the U.S. moving in the direction of the Manhattan Project. The letter that was signed by Einstein, but it was drafted by Szilard, and Szilard persuaded Einstein that the problem was really serious, the threat of a German bomb was really serious, and that we had to do something to protect the rest of the world from that threat. Then after the Second World War, Szilard once again became very active in public debate, and this in a number of different forms. He played a prominent role in the effort of the bomb physics community in the fall of 45 and the spring and summer of 46 to oppose a piece of legislation that had been introduced in Congress that would have given post-war control of everything having to do with atomic energy to the military. People in the Manhattan Project who had worked under close military scrutiny throughout the war were almost to a person of the opinion that military control of atomic energy was a bad thing, that it should be under the control of a civilian government agency. They opened up an office in D.C. They learned how to do old-fashioned politics, stalking the halls of Congress, pressing the flesh, chatting up their own senators and Congress people. And amazingly, they succeeded. And in the late spring, early summer, a different piece of legislation was introduced that indeed set up what we then called the Atomic Energy Commission, which until the mid-1960s was the civilian agency that oversaw everything from making electricity with nuclear power to building atomic weapons to manufacturing radioisotopes for medical purposes. The bomb physics community won that argument and significantly changed the course of policy in a really important way and with lasting effect.
Did Oppenheimer come around at this point? Was he part of this movement in Washington to influence policy?
Oppenheimer in the late 40s and early 50s was still being rather coy about a lot of this. He didn't take really bold public stands. To what extent he sympathized with that movement, let me just confess, I don't know the answer to that question. But he certainly did not put himself out in the public eye in the way in which Szilard and a lot of other people did at the time. And that's, of course, consistent with the position that he had taken in those internal debates within the Manhattan Project about whether or not the project scientists had a role in policy debate.
What other ways did these atomic scientists communicate with each other in policy and with the general public?
Well, they did a number of things. Very quickly after the end of the Second World War, they set up, for example, the organization that was first known as the Federation of Atomic Scientists, then they quickly changed the name to the Federation of American Scientists, which was set up mainly for the purpose of promoting public education about atomic energy, on the argument that the voters have to be part of the conversation about what we're going to do with this new technology. And for them to exercise that responsibility properly, they had to be as well informed as we could make them. That was one of the main motivations for setting up the Federation of Atomic Scientists. The other thing they did at more or less the same time was they established the magazine, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And again, this was going to be, or was designed to be, the print vehicle for sharing information with the broad public as much as could be shared about atomic nuclear technology. The Federation of American Scientists is still to this day a thriving organization. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is still around, is still having a huge impact. The Bulletin and the Federation have both expanded their briefs today to include more than just issues of atomic energy. It's noteworthy that both organizations have added the challenge of climate change to their brief, seeing climate change, global warming, as an existential threat to humankind on a par with the threat of atomic weapons. You might be familiar with the beautiful, ingenious graphic device that was introduced by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 1947 in order to make really vivid the sense of urgency they felt about the threat to the world posed by atomic weapons. And this is what has come to be called the Doomsday Clock, that was featured on the cover of every issue of the Bulletin. And the idea was that the measure of the severity of the threat was expressed in terms of how close to midnight were the hands of the clock. To this day, every year in January, there's a big public event where the Bulletin reveals where they're moving the hands of the clock today. The bad news is that today, the hands of the clock, both because of continuing concerns about atomic weapons and obviously concerns about climate change, the hands of the clock are closer to midnight than they have ever been in the history of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists.
I was just about to ask, how close have we ever been? But you're saying now we're closer to kind of destroying ourselves than we ever have been.
Well, that's what the staff of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is trying to say to the public, that you put the two threats together and you cannot help but think that Armageddon is around the corner. That's an exaggeration, of course.
We aren't actually done yet, because the scientists go out and they get a win when they separate the military control of the weapon from civilian control. But we didn't stop building bombs. What is the existential threat that spurs us on to create the hydrogen bomb? Was there a moral quandary there about building the H-bomb?
there was a much more significant moral and political debate about building the H-bomb than occurred when we built the atomic bomb under the aegis of the Manhattan Project. Why did we build the hydrogen bomb? One, because we knew it was technically possible.
So wait, is this another technically sweet problem?
Well, for some, it certainly was. In fact, in many ways, it was an even more fascinating technical challenge than building the atomic bomb. So yes, it was a technically sweet challenge. It was also somewhat like the logic at the time the Manhattan Project was launched, in that a lot of people thought it inevitable that the Soviet Union would begin the development of hydrogen bombs, and that if we didn't do it, if we, as a result, didn't have a credible deterrent to a Soviet H-bomb, then we would be vulnerable in a way that we didn't want to be vulnerable. Remember, now we're talking the late 40s, the early 50s. It's the height of the Red Scare in the US. It's the McCarthy period in the US. Public anxiety about the threat of communist expansion in Europe and Asia was at a high level. That had a lot to do with the decision to set about developing the hydrogen bomb. And that the Soviets would attempt to do this was in the end validated by the fact that, in fact, the Soviets were the first to test a thermonuclear weapon shortly before we conducted our first test. This didn't happen without controversy. There were many people who went out of their way to express reservations about the wisdom of building the hydrogen bomb. So Hans Bethe, who was heavily involved after the war in continuing work at Los Alamos, he made very clear that he had serious reservations about building the H-bomb. Curiously, he continued to consult on building the H-bomb until 1955. When something changed and he finally said, no, I'm done with this. I'm never again going to involve myself in designing or building weapons of mass destruction. But up through 55, he did continue to work, though, as I say, expressing concerns about the wisdom of going the H-bomb route. The other person whose career was in effect destroyed by his rumored opposition to the H-bomb was Oppenheimer himself. He was hugely influential, and people in positions of authority within the military, within the US government, were worried that were he to be overly public with his expressions of concern about the H-bomb, that could really set back work on the project. And as you surely know, where this led was a set of top secret hearings in the early 1950s that were ostensibly for the purpose of examining the question whether or not Oppenheimer was a security risk. He had been a real leftist in his politics back in the 1930s, for example. Some people thought that he had in fact been a Soviet agent all along, which is just not true. But they conducted these top secret security hearings to examine the question whether or not he was a security risk. And in the end, they removed his security clearance. Now, historians all understand that what this was really about was just silencing him as a critic of the H-bomb. And in that, they succeeded.
There are a couple of things that interest me about the debate around the H-bomb. I understand the Manhattan Project and kind of the moral, ethical concerns and opinions and kind of thoughts surrounding that project. I understand where they're coming from on that one. But the H-bomb, so many scientists called it the hell bomb. They called it a weapon of mass extermination. They had so many of these horrific images of it and what it could do, yet they still agreed to participate, knowing what it could do. That's where I start wondering why they would participate. And I want to talk this through with you. One is it's technically sweet, and that whole kind of like, we have to solve this problem. The other is that I'm really downplaying the threat that the Soviet Union played in their minds, and that to them, a lot of them, being these Jewish scientists that fled Nazism, the threat that they felt from communism was as strong as the threat they felt from seeing their family and their friends being hauled off to concentration camps. And I guess I just can't rectify that in my mind because you're so far away. Like the threat just doesn't seem that imminent to me.
Well, partly that's a function of our distance in time from that period. And I was a child in the 1950s and starting to be alert to the world. And I remember vividly all of the fear that we lived with, that we might be the targets of a surprise attack by the Soviet Union. I remember the day when I was in junior high school, when at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as we had declared a naval quarantine of Cuba and had ordered Khrushchev to stop the approach of freighters that were carrying more nuclear-capable missiles into Cuba. And initially, Khrushchev had said, no way, full speed ahead. And Kennedy had made it clear that if they breached the quarantine line, we would fire upon those ships. And we all knew that if it came to that, the likelihood of nuclear war with the Soviet Union was extremely high. And I remember the day when that confrontation was playing out. Curiously, the principal of my junior high school, knowing that this was very much on everyone's mind, he chose to put a live radio news feed through the PA system in the school all day long. We moved from class to class as we normally would, but we didn't do any work. We just sat there in growing fear, listening to these ever more dire news reports. I remember especially vividly my last class of the day. It was a geography class. And this would have been maybe 2:33 in the afternoon. And it's as that final confrontation was about to occur. And no one knew whether the Russian ships were going to stop or not. And I can still call to mind the image. I was sitting toward the back of the classroom. Half of the class was just sobbing, literally just sobbing. I remember how many kids had their heads down on their desks and their hands over their heads. Just, they were so frightened. And I myself, I didn't break down in tears, but I was really scared. And then the bell rang and we were discharged. And that meant that at the crucial moment, suddenly we weren't hearing the news. And we had to go get on the buses and be taken home, not knowing what was going to happen. And in all honesty, I remember sitting there on the bus in front of the school, getting ready for it to move out, thinking, I'm not going to see my parents. We're going to be dead before we get home. That's a feeling that is never going to disappear from my memory. We had special reason in my hometown for being afraid of what might happen. And that is that we lived 7 or 8 miles as the crow flies from what was then one of the major plants that was part of U.S. nuclear weapons manufacturing. It was called the Fernald plant, or the euphemism that was used, the made-up name was the Feed Materials Processing Plant, something like that. But what this was, it's the facility that took highly enriched uranium in the form of uranium hexafluoride gas and then converted that into metallic uranium, which was then shipped to other facilities in the U.S. for machining into bomb parts. Not everybody in my area knew what was there, but my father was a firefighter, and he and all of the first responders had been trained in emergency response should there ever be an accident, for example, at that Fernald plant. So he knew perfectly well what was there. And it was obvious to so many of us that were there an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, we would be really high on the target list. So yes, it's hard for people today to really appreciate the intensity of the fear that a lot of folks felt. But let me go back to your remark about the refugee scientists, because that's an important part of the story. One of the most prominent advocates of the H-bomb was the refugee Hungarian Jewish physicist Edward Teller, who tried to present himself as, quote, the father of the H-bomb, that's an exaggeration. He was a very important part of the development of the H-bomb. And he's a stunning example of someone who, in a different way, was eager to be part of the public debate. He was always agitating in public for the continued aggressive development of thermonuclear weapons. And I actually happen to be friends with his son, who's also a philosopher of science, like I am. And I know that it was the same kind of fear he felt as a refugee from Nazism. That fear was just as acute in Teller, though now it was fear of the threat posed by expansionist communism. But that was a hugely powerful motivation. For others, less so, who didn't have that personal history. But it's part of what made him such an effective public advocate for the aggressive development of thermonuclear weapons.
Is there anything in modern time that even approaches the fear that was felt?
Well, maybe a global pandemic starts to rise to that level. But no, I think it was something special in many ways. And why do I say that? It's because this was a kind of existential threat that had an immediacy that other existential threats don't have. Climate change might render our planet seriously uninhabitable in 150 years, but that's 150 years from now. If there had been an all-out nuclear exchange between the US and the Soviet Union in the 1950s or the 1960s, it would have been over in a matter of minutes. And I think that contributed to the high sense of anxiety, was just the scale and the immediacy of the threat.
Was it also that there was nothing you could do to protect yourself, really?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because in fact, there was nothing you could do to protect yourself. But the US and the Soviet Union, the US more so than the Soviet Union, tried to create the illusion that nuclear war was survivable. Yeah, it will be awful, but it's survivable. And that's why in the 1950s, we began this project of building fallout shelters and bomb shelters all around the country. Typically in the basements of really solidly built buildings. They were pre-stocked with enough water, food, blankets, medical supplies, so that people sheltering there could stay underground for at least a couple of weeks, the thinking being that the level of radioactivity in the fallout would have diminished enough within a couple of weeks so that you could begin to venture out. We had these nationwide bomb drills in the 50s and 60s, where the air raid sirens would go off, all regular broadcasting would be canceled, the emergency broadcast system would be activated. We did these bomb drills in schools. You've heard the expression duck and cover. Another vivid memory I have from my junior high school years is that we weren't instructed to crawl under our desks and cover. What we were instructed to do was to march in an orderly fashion down to the basement. Each classroom had an assigned section in the hallway in the basement. And then we were supposed to squat down with our backs against the wall, put our heads between our knees, our hands over our heads. And we did those drills, just like fire drills.
That's a tornado drill.
Well, it would work a lot better with a tornado than it would with hydrogen bombs falling on you. But we knew these were bomb drills.
We get the H-bomb. The Soviets get the H-bomb. We have France, we have Britain, we have China. We have more countries becoming nuclear weapon states. But really, it's the Soviet and the US that has this massive stockpile of weapons. And it's not just the public that starts calling for disarmament, but the bomb scientists start calling for it as well.
That's very true. And let me talk about two episodes that really vividly demonstrate this. So by the late 1950s, anxiety within the technical community here in the US about the lack of progress towards arms control was such that they asked themselves, is there something more that we might be able to do to move us in the direction of a safer world? They'd set up all these organizations. They had the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Einstein, in the years before his death, made public statement after public statement calling for nuclear disarmament. Nothing seemed to be working. There was such an impasse between the Soviet Union and the US. They weren't really even talking with one another about the problem. So they said, is there something creatively different that we might do to sort of shake things up and create some openings that might help move us in the right direction? And yet again, Szilard is a major figure, along with the physicist Joseph Rotblat, who set up what came to be called the Pugwash conferences. What were the Pugwash conferences? Well, first of all, why were they called the Pugwash conferences? It's because the very first one was held in the small coastal village of Pugwash in Nova Scotia. Why there? It's because a wealthy Cleveland industrialist, Cyrus Eaton, had a summer house there that he just made available to the scientists involved in this. What was the concept of the Pugwash conferences and the ensuing Pugwash movement, as it came to be called? The idea was to bring together, in a somewhat sheltered environment, prominent scientists from all of the major nations of the world. Not the people immediately advising government, not the people working at the highest level within Los Alamos, for example, but still people who are totally well informed about what's going on. Bring together scientific representatives of all these nations, put them together in one place to get them talking with one another. In the beginning, what they wanted to do was just get them together to talk about their kids, play poker, take a stroll along the beach. I mean, just do ordinary human things with colleagues from around the world of a kind that weren't happening. Build trust, build a sense that we can talk with one another. And having built some trust, then turn the conversation at these Pugwash conferences to the question, well, as scientists, are there things that we could do scientifically to help nudge us in the right direction? The very first specific technical problem they took up was this. There had already been talk about whether or not we should institute a ban on atmospheric nuclear testing, because of concern about all the fallout from that. But no progress is being made. One reason progress wasn't being made was because both sides were afraid that there was no way they could accurately verify compliance with a ban on atmospheric testing. Lots of people had had one interesting technical idea for how to address this, and that is, why can't we look for the seismic signatures of bomb tests? Clever idea. But then two technical problems. One, how do you distinguish the seismic signature of a hydrogen bomb from the seismic signature of an earthquake? Well, hey, that's a technical problem. Let's work on it. And the second technical issue was, assume we're successful in figuring out the difference in those signatures, how many monitoring stations would we have to set up all around the world, and where would they have to be located so as to bring above a certain threshold, like 90% or 95%, the likelihood that any atmospheric test would be detected? Again, that's a technical problem, different kind of technical problem. But what grew out of these Pugwash conferences was technical work on those two problems. And within the space of like 3 or 4 years, they had basically solved those two technical problems. Many observers are of the opinion that it was the success of that effort that grew out of the Pugwash movement that made possible the negotiation and the eventual signing and ratification in 1963 of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty between the US and the Soviet Union. Just as I'm impressed by what the bomb physics community did in 1945-46 with setting up the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, with lobbying Congress for civilian control, I'm equally impressed by the creativity and determination of the technical community in once again taking it upon themselves to do non-technical work to become part of a policy debate. And in this case, they were effective in a different manner, but they were effective. The other episode I want to share is this. Too often we think about this here in the U.S. entirely from a U.S. perspective. We just think, many people today still think, Soviet Union, evil empire, they all were soulless communists, and that's definitely not true. And as much credit as we should give to the participants in the Pugwash movement should also be given to one individual in the Soviet Union, and that is Andrei Sakharov, who was the father of the Russian H-bomb.
Not like Teller, but like actually the father of the H-bomb.
In a more literal sense, yes, in a more literal sense. I mean, lots of people were involved in the Soviet H-bomb project, but he was understood to be clearly the person who made it all possible. From very early on, after they began to test their hydrogen weapons, Sakharov grew really deeply morally concerned about the health risks of fallout from atmospheric testing. It is remembered by one of his biographers that the first test was delayed a little bit because Sakharov had done a back of the envelope calculation trying to literally estimate how many people would die because of that one H-bomb test from the radioactivity and the fallout. He got the calculation wrong. He erred on the size of too large an estimate. It's still a real thing. People are killed by individual atmospheric nuclear tests. But when he saw the number, or at least the order of magnitude, he was shaken to the core of his being. And my God, what am I doing? How can we be doing this? Of course, he found himself locked into a political institutional situation where there was no question that they were going to continue their development work on hydrogen weapons. But he began right then and there lobbying Khrushchev personally and directly. He had a phone in his office that led directly to Khrushchev's office, and he was not shy about picking it up.
I want to mention this was dangerous at the time.
In the end, it turned out to be catastrophic for Sakharov.
But even at the time, he could have lost his life in the Soviet Union for going against...
Of course he could. Of course he could. But bear in mind, he did enjoy a measure of protection because of the fact that he was such a famous guy and was seen by the Soviet government as indispensable to the development of the Soviet H-bomb. So he understood that he enjoyed some protection. He had some room to maneuver that others might not have had. But anyway, he began already in the late 1950s, seizing every opportunity he could to try to persuade Khrushchev that you got to negotiate a treaty banning atmospheric nuclear testing. It's the confluence of these various movements, Sakharov putting himself at risk to press the case for a ban on atmospheric nuclear testing. The people in the Pugwash movement attacking this from the technical side, trying to remove some technical impediments to writing such a treaty. It's the confluence of those actions that finally did make it possible to negotiate that treaty. And that's an historically important moment, because that moment in 1963 marks the first time we did work out a treaty with the Soviet Union to begin to get this under control. And it marks the beginning of the sequence of treaties that we negotiated over the next 30 years that in the end actually did it. Not many people remember how big these arsenals were at their maximum. If you look at about the mid-1980s, at both the Soviet and the US nuclear arsenals, each side had many tens of thousands of nuclear warheads in their arsenals, far more than would have been necessary to totally demolish the adversary. One term that was often used to talk about this overcapacity was overkill, or the even more amusing expression that was used by one American authority was, when asked about why we need all these bombs, said, well, to make the rubble bounce. To make the rubble bounce. Anyway, by the mid-1980s, that was the magnitude of the arsenals. But those treaties that we negotiated began to kick in the mid-1980s. And by the early 2000s, we had brought those arsenals down to sort of, in order of magnitude terms, close to where we are today, which is just a couple of thousand on either side, just a few thousand on either side. Still a lot, still worrisome. But again, you can't underestimate the importance of that limited nuclear test ban treaty in breaking the logjam and creating the conditions of trust and cooperation that made possible all that other treaty writing.
Do you think it's because we're the ones that are creating all this horrible technology that we're the ones that have to deal with these moral conflicts? Or is this something that all scientists should have to worry about?
Well, the physics community doesn't have a monopoly on taking responsibility for what's done with the fruits of one's research. There are lots of people in the biosciences who have expressed comparable kinds of concern about worrisome technologies, and in many other scientific fields. What's different is that it was, for the most part, the physics community that was the first, historically, to find itself drawn into the development of weapons of mass destruction. Yes, biologists and chemists had been involved in biological warfare research and chemical warfare research, but not on the scale of the Manhattan Project. And I think that had a significant impact on the physics community and a lasting impact on the physics community, making physicists on the whole rather more alert to what their responsibilities are for the products of their research. Even there, I wouldn't exaggerate. It's not as though every physicist loses sleep at night worrying about what your current work in nanomaterials is going to wind up being used for. But I think that there is a difference, that sense of responsibility is felt more keenly in the physics community. But we can't shortchange these other technical communities. Another example that I like to share with my students is what's called the Asilomar Conference. What was the Asilomar Conference? This is a conference that took place in the mid-1980s when what we then called gene splicing technology was in its infancy. And a number of people who were prominent in that field in its early years began to grow concerned about the possibility that there's something they might do by way of manipulating, especially a viral or a bacterial genome, in such a way as to make possible an accidental release of some agent that could cause a serious epidemic or pandemic. And so they called together a bunch of people for a week-long meeting to just thrash this out, to talk about how serious the concern should be. Can anything be done about it? And what came out of the Asilomar Conference was a voluntary moratorium on gene splicing research, where people were asked to stop doing that research for a period of time and instead turn their labs over to doing work on how to mitigate the danger. And they spent roughly a year working on the technical problem. And at the end of the year, they had convinced themselves that, well, yes, there are protocols that we can put in place. There are things we can do, like choosing to work on or experimental work only on viruses or bacteria that would be non-viable outside of highly controlled laboratory conditions. So in other words, it couldn't just spill on the floor and then run amok. And out of that grew these biosafety standards that are now commonplace in biomedical research. So they convinced themselves that they could do this safely, and then they restarted the work on gene manipulation. But again, I think that's a remarkable example of a scientific community realizing that they got a problem, that the work they're doing might be dangerous in ways that we should be concerned about, and then taking the initiative themselves to do something about that problem. As much as we should remind our students about the pugwash movement, we should also remind our students about Asilomar. It's another shining example of scientists standing up, taking responsibility, and acting.
And I had never heard of that example, but I really appreciate it and I like it because by the scientists taking that initiative, they're able to come up with their own rules and their own, even though they took a year out, they're able to come up with their own way of doing it instead of having some external organization come in and tell them what to do.
Yeah, self-regulation. Yeah. Now, government standards did eventually emerge from all of this. So NIH now has in place all sorts of guidelines and standards that have to be adhered to. But yes, that's right.
So what about the argument when people talk about the H-bomb or other weapons of other countries are going to do it? So why shouldn't we do it? And if we're going to do it, don't you want the best people working on that project?
That's an all too common logic. And there is some logic to that. But my response to that kind of argument has long been that it's sort of a false dilemma in that it poses two options. Either you build it or you don't build it. Well, maybe there are compelling practical reasons why at the moment you should start research on whatever it is we're talking about. But why can't you at the very same time do everything you can to get into conversation with your potential adversaries to talk through the question of whether or not we should both go down this path? And if we still think we're going to do it, are there things that we can do collaboratively to mitigate the dangers? That's a missing piece in that kind of an argument.
You're also assuming a level of trust with your adversaries, because of course the argument then is, well, how do you know that you can trust your adversary to not do whatever it is you've agreed not to do?
Well, trust is, of course, necessary. One doesn't want to be foolish and naive in one's trusting. I always think of the famous words of Ronald Reagan at a time when he was involved in negotiating some of these nuclear arms reduction treaties. He said, trust but verify. So, yeah, you have to have trust. You have to try to build trust, but you've also got to verify.
I think we both agree that we should be training scientists about the impact of their work. Where do we need it the most?
Well, I'm reluctant to try to develop a scorecard of comparative moral risk. I mean, yes, of course there are differences. Climate change and nuclear weapons are bigger problems than GMOs, for example. I mean, that's a judgment that I can safely make. But still, I don't know that I would be helped in my thinking by trying to construct a linear ordering of comparative degrees of moral threat and moral risk. Instead, what I would urge, and it's implicit in something you just said a moment ago, is that we encourage our colleagues, we encourage our students to pay attention to the many different kinds of moral challenges that can arise in connection with their scientific and engineering work. We need to work very hard to equip our colleagues and our students with the toolkits they need for careful reflection on these problems. We need to work hard to expose our colleagues and our students to what in philosophical ethics we sometimes refer to as moral exemplars. That is, just individuals who have demonstrated an uncommon capacity for alertness and intelligent engagement with moral challenges, and just hold them up as examples. In essence, that's what I've been doing in this conversation when I hold up the character of Szilard, who was remarkable as a moral exemplar. Or Sakharov. I mean, what he did in the Soviet Union took incredible courage. And in the end, of course, he lost all of his privileges. For many years, he was in a kind of weird house arrest where he was sent to a small isolated town that was a sealed Soviet research facility. And he was cut off from communication with the outside world, for all intents and purposes, cut off from communication with the outside world. But that just makes him an even more compelling moral exemplar when you understand the sacrifice he wound up making. I think that's where our energies need to be focused. For all that I enjoy the doomsday clock, there's something a little kooky about the whole thing. It's a little gimmicky and so forth, but still it works. I mean, it's a compelling way to get the public thinking about challenges. But I think we really need, as educators, we really need to think about education.
I agree. And we met on a committee called CIFS, the Committee on Intellectual Freedom of Scientists. For one, it's probably the most rewarding committee I have ever served on in my life.
Oh, exactly the same here, far and away.
But the other thing is that most people that are in physics don't even know the committee exists, even if they are a member of the American Physical Society. And the other question that is always asked is, wait, physicists deal in human rights? Can you give our audience a little bit about the committee and why it's in the APS?
Well, the history of CIFS is interesting. It came into existence very late 1970s. I think 79 was the date of its founding. And the events that really triggered its creation, the events that made it clear to the professional physics community in the US that something had to be done here, was not unrelated to the story I told about Sakharov. It's because we saw in the 1970s, and it continued into the 1980s, a new generation of scientific refugees, except now they were coming from the Soviet Union. There were many of them, and we worked very hard to absorb them into the US scientific community, physicists especially. I don't know the full history of this from the Soviet side, but I wouldn't be surprised to find that so many Russian physicists were just inspired by the heroic example of Sakharov, that they sort of followed his lead and said, we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to speak out. And they paid the price in having to restart their careers in the US. Much of the leadership of CIFS in its early years came from that Russian emigre community. So that was the local circumstance. It was local to that time. But then it quickly became evident that there were challenges to intellectual freedom, scientific freedom, coming from many parts of the world. China in the 1980s is another example where there were many cases of sometimes really awful persecution of scientists who had found the courage to speak out about human rights issues. And then as time went on, cases have begun to emerge in lots of different parts of the world. As you know from our service on CIFS, a lot of cases have come out of Iran. A lot of cases have come out of Turkey. Cases have come out of Israel. It comes as a shock to a lot of people to be told that, in fact, there have been such cases coming out of the United States. And CIFS has been majorly involved in some of those cases. It's truly an international challenge.
And there's an award that we give out that is the Sakharov Prize.
Indeed, it's the Sakharov Prize. How appropriate.
Yes. And there are still a few people that have not given their prize talks because they have not been able to leave their home country.
That's correct. Some of them are still in prison.
So are all the people who get the Sakharov Prize, are all the people that we talk about people who are in prison and being persecuted?
Well, it's interesting that the prize has been awarded in some occasions to people whom you wouldn't really categorize as human rights activists in the sense of people who are campaigning on behalf of those who are persecuted. There have been cases of the prize being awarded for people who do economic development work or community development work, or helping to expand technical educational opportunities for people in countries that are under-resourced. So it's not that they're all themselves victims of persecution. It's that they are people who have invested in various different ways, have made a serious investment of their time and energy and concern in helping to make the world a better place.
That's what CIFS really did for me, is expand my knowledge of what are human rights and what are scientific rights, and how as a physicist I can be involved in small and large ways, and really kind of fill that need in me to do something for the larger world instead of just my technical skills. I hope that young people know that they can pursue those interests, human rights or community justice activities, and still be a scientist.
Well, as you know, I seize every opportunity to share that message with students. For more than 10 years now, I've been teaching ethics workshops for students who come to Notre Dame in the summer for the REU program, physics REU program, research experience for undergraduates. And I spend a couple of days every summer walking them through much of the very history that we've been talking about here, using that as a place to go to help them mature their thinking about the moral issues that can and will continue to confront scientists. So the way I wrap up those workshops every year is by telling my students the story of Omid Kokabi. He's from Iran. He was a physics graduate student at the University of Texas about 10 years ago, who, after his first semester at UT, went back home to Tehran to visit with his family over the holidays. And then when he got to the airport in Tehran to come back, he was arrested on utterly bogus charges of collaborating with enemies of the Islamic State. And, you can write the script. When, in fact, what had happened was that he had been recruited to work on the Iranian nuclear weapons project, and he had refused to do that.
Was he a nuclear physicist?
I'll come back to what he was working on in just a moment. I mean, yes, he was involved in nuclear physics, but he just refused to be part of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. That's why he was arrested. That's why he was found guilty on these bogus charges. That's why he was sent to the infamous Evin prison in Tehran on a 10-year sentence. He eventually was released after about 5 years, after he grew very, very, very sick and needed sophisticated medical care. But he's an example, a really compelling example of a young scientist whose freedom to be a scientist was massively affected. What was really going on there? There's still a lot of unclarity about it, but this much we know. What he had done for his master's degree in Spain was work on laser isotope separation. And UT Austin, its physics department, had great strengths in laser isotope separation, and that's what he was going to focus on at UT Austin. Well, what can you use laser isotope separation for? It's just another way of separating U-235 and enriching uranium for use in reactors or use in bombs. And I've always thought that it was the fact that he was being trained specifically in that made the Iranians so sensitive to what might happen were he to get out of Iran again and spill the beans about possible Iranian development of that technology. But I use this example of Kokabi because he was such a young kid. And he never grew up thinking that he was going to find himself at the age of, 23 in the international limelight in this way. He's somebody that these kids can relate to. They see themselves in the character of a young Omid Kokabi. And I think it helps them to appreciate in more visceral terms what could happen to people. Not that they're at immediate risk of the kind of persecution that he endured, but at least it makes vivid to them in a way that stories about octogenarian refugee scientists of another era just don't seem vivid to them.
No, I agree. I mean, it's a very sad case.
So I just said a moment ago that I think one of the places we need as educators to focus our attention is, obviously, education. We need to be creative in finding effective ways of growing the moral sophistication of our students, their alertness to the moral challenges that they could find themselves facing. We need to do a lot to equip them with the sort of conceptual tools that they need for thinking through complicated moral problems. We just need to build more engagement with ethics into our curricula. And this is a part of the training of scientists, not just the humanists, but as part of the training of scientists and engineers. But I want to end on a happy note. I want to end with good news. And it is this. At Notre Dame, partly because we're Notre Dame, but at Notre Dame, we have invested very, very heavily over the past decade in building courses of many different kinds that engage technology ethics in one way or another. Started with a course 11 years ago now on the ethics of emerging weapons technologies. We built a course on robot ethics. For students in our Silicon Valley program, we built a course on the ethics of responsible technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Last spring, I rolled out a brand new course on data ethics for a new undergraduate data sciences program that was designed from the ground up to be an ethics-centric data sciences program. That's the good news. I think we are blessed to be working right now with a younger generation that is more alert to these kinds of issues, more interested in investing their own talents in addressing these kinds of issues than perhaps any generation since that of the 60s and early 70s. I've been teaching over that entire time span, and that's certainly my subjective sense of how things have changed generation by generation. So it's really gratifying to me to have the opportunity at a late stage in my career to help all of these eager and inquisitive and really deeply caring young people. And I encourage my colleagues everywhere to be creative. I guarantee you, build it and they will come. I guarantee that.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you to Don for a great conversation. And I also want to thank him for nominating me to SIFS, where we served together for a few years. Honestly, until I heard about SIFS, I had no idea that scientists had human rights committees in their professional organizations or that I could take part. For more information about our podcast, please visit our website at mynuclearlife.com or ask us a question or send us comments at mynuclearlife@protonmail.com. We also have a Patreon page, which you can subscribe to and receive bonus content, including extra information that didn't make it into this podcast with Don. To help us out, leave us a rating or a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, I'm Shelly Lesher, and this has been another episode of My Nuclear Life.